I sat there in stunned silence, the menu still open in my trembling hands, as my own daughter looked the waiter in the eye and said, "Skip her. She doesn't matter." The restaurant buzzed around me, candles flickering, glasses clinking. But all I could hear was the sound of my dignity being shattered in public. That night, something inside me shifted. I may have stayed quiet at the table, but when I got home, I rewrote my will and erased her from my future. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me the story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The restaurant buzzed with chatter, every table crowded with laughing couples and young professionals clinking glasses. Candlelight flickered in polished holders, throwing golden shadows across the glossy menus, and tall windows streaked with winter drizzle. The air carried a mix of rosemary chicken, seared steak, and truffle oil, the aromas weaving around Margaret as she adjusted her seat at the table. She had dressed carefully for the evening. A navy blouse pressed crisp, a string of pearls David had once clasped around her neck. She wanted to look presentable beside her daughter and son-in-law in this trendy downtown Chicago spot. She wanted, perhaps foolishly, to feel like she still belonged at their table. Rachel and Tom sat opposite her, their posture straight, their eyes flicking around as if cataloging who might be watching. Rachel, in her sleek black dress, leaned toward her husband, whispering something that made him smirk. Sophie sat beside Margaret, her expression soft, her phone tucked away. Unlike her parents, she seemed present, grounded. The waiter appeared, pad in hand, smiling politely. "And for you, ma'am?" he asked, turning to Margaret. She opened her menu, finger tracing the options, when Rachel's voice cut across like glass shattering. "Skip her order," Rachel said casually, handing her own menu back. "She doesn't matter." The words dropped heavy, loud enough for the waiter to pause mid-motion, for Tom to chuckle uncomfortably, for Sophie to sit upright in disbelief. Margaret froze, her face flushed hot, the heat creeping up her neck to her cheeks. The laughter and clinking from surrounding tables seemed to swell, as though every stranger in the restaurant had suddenly heard, had suddenly agreed. The waiter hesitated, his polite smile faltering. His eyes flicked between Margaret and Rachel, unsure whether to proceed or retreat. "She does matter," Sophie said firmly, her young voice cutting through the awkward silence. She looked at the waiter, her chin lifted. "She wants the salmon." "Right, Grandma?" Margaret swallowed, her throat tight. She nodded slowly, her voice lost for the moment. Rachel waved a dismissive hand, her bracelets clinking. "Just bring the check later." "We'll sort it out," she leaned back in, her chair satisfied, as if erasing her mother's presence was as simple as adjusting the bill. The table sat in strained silence. Margaret lowered her eyes to the menu in her lap, the words blurring. Her chest ached, not just from the cruelty, but from the finality of it. Her daughter hadn't just embarrassed her, she had reduced her to nothing in public, in front of strangers, in front of family. Sophie's hand slipped under the table, giving her grandmother's a quick, firm squeeze. It steadied her enough to exhale, to let her shoulders settle back into place. The waiter, still flustered, scribbled Margaret's order after all, muttering, "Of course, ma'am," before hurrying away. Tom cleared his throat, reaching for his wine glass. "Rachel," he murmured, "let's just eat." "Don't make a scene," Rachel rolled her eyes. "I didn't make a scene. I made a point." Margaret looked at her daughter then, really looked, the sharpness in her eyes, the cold line of her jaw. The woman who once curled into her lap during thunderstorms, now capable of slicing her mother apart with a single remark. Something inside Margaret shifted. The humiliation hardened into resolve, the sting into calculation. She had built a life on numbers, on keeping ledgers straight, on ensuring everything balanced. Tonight her daughter had written her out with words. But Margaret knew another ledger waited at home, one her daughter had no idea could erase her just as easily. She closed her menu slowly, sliding it aside, her decision already forming like ink drying on a page. Across the table, Sophie watched her carefully, as if she sensed her grandmother had begun planning something deeper than just a quiet car ride home. Margaret lifted her glass, taking a measured sip of water. The taste was cold, metallic, cleansing. She let it linger on her tongue before swallowing, her eyes steady on Rachel. Her daughter might have skipped her at dinner, but Margaret knew exactly where she would be erased next. The door shut behind her with a hollow click. The silence of the condo wrapped around her, thick and absolute, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. She slipped off her shoes, setting them neatly by the mat, an old habit David had kept, one of the many she still honored in his absence. Margaret moved into the living room, the city lights glowing faint through the tall windows. The air carried the faint scent of lavender from the sachets tucked in drawers, a small comfort against the sting still burning in her chest. She lowered her coat onto the arm of the sofa and sat for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the quiet. Her phone buzzed on the table. She reached for it, already knowing who it would be. A single text glowed across the screen from Sophie. "I'm sorry, Grandma. She was cruel." Margaret's throat tightened. Her thumbs hovered, then tapped carefully. "Don't apologize for her. I'll fix this." She set the phone down, her hand lingering over it before pulling back. The apartment suddenly felt too neat, too orderly, every frame on the wall perfectly aligned, every cushion in place. She needed disorder, something to move, something to change. Rising, she walked to the hallway closet and pulled down the heavy leather binder from the top shelf. The edges were worn, the zipper cool against her fingertips. This was the binder she and David had put together years ago, organized to the last detail. Bank accounts, pension files, property deeds, insurance policies. And tucked inside, the will they had drafted together when Sophie was still a little girl with bows in her hair. David had insisted on preparing everything. "One day," he'd said, "we'll need to know every number, every name. We'll leave nothing to chance." Margaret carried the binder to the dining table, its weight solid in her arms. She unzipped it slowly, the sound sharp in the quiet condo, and spread it open across the wood. Plastic sleeves held documents in tidy rows. She flipped until she reached the section marked Estate Planning. Her breath caught. There, in clear type, was Rachel's name. Primary heir. The words glared back at her, smug and absolute. The daughter who had humiliated her in public would one day inherit everything David and she had built. His savings from a lifetime of careful work, her retirement funds, the condo they had chosen together. All of it going to a woman who had waved her hand at her own mother and said, "She doesn't matter." Margaret's jaw tightened. She reached for a pen from the drawer. With one deliberate motion, she circled Rachel's name in thick red ink, the line biting into the page. The circle wasn't just ink, it was a target. Her phone buzzed again. "Sophie, I love you, Grandma." Margaret stared at the message, her hand trembling slightly as warmth spread through her chest. She typed back, "I love you too, sweetheart, and I'll make sure you're protected." She closed the binder for a moment, resting her palms against the leather cover. The weight of it was both heavy and liberating. For decades, she had been careful, polite, measured. Tonight, she was something else. Rising, she walked to her desk in the corner of the room. The old lamp cast a pool of yellow light as she flipped open her contacts. Her finger hovered briefly, then pressed David Ross. The estate attorney had been recommended years ago by a friend, but Margaret had never thought she'd need him so urgently. Tonight she did. The phone rang twice before his voicemail clicked on, his calm professional voice filling the line. "David Ross, Estate Planning. Please leave your name and number." Margaret inhaled slowly, her decision steady, then spoke into the quiet. "Mr. Ross, this is Margaret Turner. I need to update my will, urgently. Please call me tomorrow morning." She ended the call and set the phone down, her reflection faint in the black screen. Her chest rose and fell in patin ats, a slow, controlled rhythm. Margaret turned back to the binder, running her hand across the red circle over Rachel's name. The decision was made. She had been erased from the dinner table, but she would erase her daughter from the one table that mattered most. The estate that held her future. The condo was silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Not heavy, not humiliating. It felt purposeful, sharpened. Margaret rose from the table, leaving the binder open, the red circle glowing under the lamplight like a promise. Tomorrow Rachel's reckoning would begin. The strip plaza smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee from the cafe next door. Margaret's heels clicked softly against the tiled floor as she entered the attorney's office, where framed diplomas lined the wall behind the reception desk. The space wasn't grand, but it was precise. Tidy bookshelves stacked with thick binders, the faint hum of a printer in the corner, and the steady buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. A woman in her 50s with silver glasses greeted her at the counter. "Mrs. Turner? Mr. Ross is ready for you." Margaret followed her into a glass-walled conference room where David Ross stood to greet her. He was tall, clean-shaven. His tie knotted neatly, his posture calm but alert. His handshake was firm, the kind that conveyed both professionalism and a quiet confidence. "Mrs. Turner," he said, gesturing toward a leather chair at the polished oak table, "I understand you'd like to make changes to your estate." Margaret lowered herself into the chair, placing her binder on the table with deliberate care. "Changes," she said softly, her voice carrying more steel than she felt. "No, overhaul." David sat across from her, pen poised above his legal pad. "Tell me what happened." The memory surged fresh as she began to speak. "My daughter. Rachel, we were at dinner. The waiter turned to me, asked what I'd like to order, and she—" Margaret's voice caught for a beat, but she steadied it. "She told him to skip me." Said I didn't matter. David's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. He simply wrote a note in quick, sharp strokes. "She humiliated me in front of strangers, in front of Sophie. My granddaughter defended me, but Rachel—" Margaret's fingers tightened against the edge of the binder. "It wasn't the first time she's dismissed me, but it will be the last. She will not inherit what David and I built." David leaned back, the pen resting in his hand. "You want her out completely?" Margaret met his eyes without hesitation. "Not 1 cent. She doesn't matter." For the first time, a faint flicker of surprise crossed his otherwise impassive face. Then he nodded slowly. "That's clear. We'll remove her and her husband entirely, name Sophie as the beneficiary, add a no-contest clause. So if Rachel tries to fight this, she risks losing even the smallest share." Margaret exhaled, her hands unclenching on the binder. "Good, Inkar." David pulled a draft template from his folder, the paper crisp, the ink of prior notes faintly smudged. He began filling in names, dates, allocations. His voice was steady as he explained. "We'll protect Sophie's inheritance until she's 25. Until then, the assets remain locked and managed under your terms. And you mentioned wanting part of your estate to go elsewhere?" "Yes," Margaret said quickly. "A portion to the senior advocacy group downtown. They help people like me, people who get dismissed." The word carried weight, pressing between them like a bruise. "Done," David said. His pen moved swiftly, lines of ink scratching across the page. He slid the draft toward her. "This is the framework. We'll finalize and sign within the week." Margaret studied the document. Rachel's name was absent, gone as though it had never been written. The absence filled her with a calm satisfaction she hadn't expected. David leaned forward. "You understand, Mrs. Turner. This will not sit quietly with her, but the law is on your side. You have the right to decide exactly how your legacy is handled." Margaret nodded, her eyes sharp. "Then she'll learn that she can't erase me without consequences." For the first time in days, Margaret felt a thread of relief untangle in her chest. This wasn't just reaction. It was action, deliberate and permanent. She zipped her binder shut, the sound decisive. "When do we sign?" "I'll have everything prepared in 48 hours, David replied. Margaret rose from her chair, her hand brushing over the table's smooth surface. "Then I'll be back." As she stepped out into the cold Chicago air, the weight of humiliation from that dinner still lingered, but now it was tethered to something stronger. Justice, forming in black ink. Her phone buzzed in her purse as she reached the car. She pulled it out, the screen glowing with an incoming email. It was from Tom. "Rachel deserves compensation for taking care of you. Don't be unfair, Margaret." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. The fight hadn't even begun, and already they were circling like vultures, and she was ready. Margaret's condo was usually her sanctuary, a space filled with order and quiet dignity. That afternoon, the winter sun slanted through the blinds, casting neat stripes across the carpet. She had just set a kettle to boil when the buzz of the intercom startled her. "Mom, it's us," Rachel's voice crackled through the speaker. Margaret's stomach tightened, but she pressed the button. The door clicked, and minutes later, Rachel and Tom stood in her living room, dressed as though they had come from some brunch with friends. Rachel in a sleek cream coat, Tom in his tailored jacket, both smelling faintly of cologne and entitlement. "Coffee?" Margaret asked evenly, though her tone carried no warmth. "No, we won't stay long," Rachel said, sliding her coat off and draping it across a chair without waiting for permission. She glanced around the condo, her eyes lingering on the framed photos, the neatly stacked books. The binder Margaret had left half-zipped on the side table. "We just wanted to check in." Tom took a seat on the couch, crossing one leg over the other. "Yes," he added smoothly. "We've been meaning to talk about the future. You know, plans, security." Margaret arched a brow. "Security for who?" Rachel perched on the arm of the sofa, folding her hands primly. "For us, Mom. For me and Tom. And for Sophie, of course. You'll leave us the condo, right? It only makes sense. I've spent years helping you, making sure you're not alone." Margaret set the kettle back down, the hiss of steam punctuating the room. "Helping me?" Her tone was clipped, her eyes narrowing. "Is that what you call it?" Tom leaned forward, his voice as polished as ever. "It's only fair, Margaret. After all we've done, driving you places, handling things when Rachel steps in. Think of it as repayment for our efforts." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt her pulse steady, not frantic, but focused. She knew their tactic: guilt framed as generosity. It was the same pattern David had warned her about years ago when Rachel first began hinting at inheritance. "What you've done," Margaret said slowly, her voice firm, "is clear." Unnoticed by Rachel and Tom, Sophie stood just outside the kitchen archway, her phone angled low, recording. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were fierce, capturing every polished word, every entitled glance. Rachel straightened, sensing resistance. "Mom, don't make this difficult. You know it's expected. Families keep things in the family." "That's the right thing to do." Margaret turned to face her daughter fully, the steam from the kettle swirling between them. "The right thing to do," she said quietly, "isn't what you think it is." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "We're not asking for much, just assurance. Peace of mind." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Peace of mind comes from honesty, Tom." Something in short supply here for the first time, Rachel faltered, her gaze darting toward Sophie, who now stepped into the room with the phone in her hand, no longer hiding it. The silence cracked, sharp and undeniable. "What's that?" Rachel snapped, her voice sharp. "A record," Sophie said. Her tone was calm, but her eyes burned. "Of you asking for what isn't yours." Rachel's face blanched, then flushed crimson. Tom's jaw tightened, but neither spoke. Margaret crossed the room, took the phone gently from Sophie's hand, and stopped the recording. She tapped save and slid the device into her pocket. Then she walked to the binder, unzipped it, and slipped the phone inside alongside the other evidence. "Thank you, Sophie," she said softly. Rachel stood abruptly, yanking her coat from the chair. "This is absurd." "You're twisting everything." "Twisting?" Margaret asked. Her voice calm, her eyes locked on her daughter's. "No, I'm documenting." Rachel sputtered something under her breath, but Tom tugged her arm, pulling her toward the door. They left without another word, their footsteps echoing in the hall, the door shutting with a hollow thud. The condo fell into silence, again save for the faint hiss of the kettle still cooling on the stove. Margaret walked to the binder, zipped it closed, and rested her palm on the cover. Inside, her defense grew stronger by the day. Her phone buzzed. She drew it out, expecting another text from Sophie. But instead, David Ross's name lit up the screen. She answered, pressing the phone to her ear. "Mrs. Turner," his calm voice said. "The documents are ready to sign." Margaret glanced toward the binder, her reflection in the glossy cover looking sharper than she remembered. "Good," she replied. "It's time." David Ross's office smelled faintly of polished wood and freshly brewed coffee. The blinds were half drawn against the pale Chicago winter light, casting slanted bars of sun across the conference table where a neat stack of papers waited. Margaret settled into the chair, her binder at her side. The air felt charged, as though the room itself understood the gravity of what she was about to do. David slid the draft toward her, his expression professional, but his eyes softened by the weight of her choice. "This," he said, tapping the first page, "removes Rachel and Tom completely. Their names do not appear anywhere. Sophie is the sole heir, but her inheritance is structured to release at 25, protected, untouchable until then. And as you requested, a percentage of your estate will go to the senior advocacy group. They'll use it to fund legal support for people in your position." Margaret read the pages carefully, each line sharp and final. Rachel's name, once there, smug in its certainty, was gone. The absence was almost startling. It was as if her daughter had never existed in this ledger of her life. Her fingers brushed over Sophie's name, neatly typed, firm in its placement. "This will keep her safe?" "Completely," David assured her. "No one can override this structure. And with the no contest clause, if Rachel tries to challenge it, she risks losing everything, even in court." Margaret's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile, but not grief either. "Good," she murmured. "She'll never humiliate me again." David handed her a pen. "Then let's make it official." The pen felt cool, heavy in her hand. She steadied herself, her breath measured, and signed. One signature, then another, each flourish cutting Rachel further out of her future. With every stroke of ink, Margaret felt the dinner table replay in her mind. The waiter's hesitant glance, Rachel's dismissive wave, Sophie's small but defiant voice, "She does matter." By the time she set the pen down, her pulse had steadied. The papers were no longer drafts, they were law. David gathered the documents, sliding them into a folder with practiced precision. He secured them with a clip and slipped the originals into a fireproof briefcase. "Airtight and final," he said, his tone resolute. Margaret exhaled, her shoulders lighter than they had been in weeks. She reached for her coat, her binder tucked securely under her arm. "Thank you, David. You've done more than you know." He stood to shake her hand. "You've done this, Mrs. Turner. You took back control." The winter air outside was biting, but it felt bracing, almost cleansing, as Margaret walked to her car. For the first time since that night in the restaurant, she felt more than hurt or anger. She felt free. She stopped at a florist on the way home, the bell above the door chiming as she entered. The air was warm, thick with the scents of roses, lilies, and eucalyptus. She selected a modest bouquet of white carnations, David's favorite, and carried them to the counter. $18.50, the clerk said kindly. Margaret slipped her debit card from her wallet, sliding it across the reader. A soft beep. Then the words glared back in red. "Declined." Her brows knitted. "Try again." The clerk obliged, swiping once more. Again, "Declined." Margaret's chest tightened. She fumbled for another card, her hands trembling slightly now, but the thought had already lodged in her mind like a splinter. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Apologizing quietly to the clerk, she left the bouquet on the counter and stepped back out into the cold. Her breath puffed in quick clouds as she unlocked her car, sliding inside with stiff fingers. She pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. The screen loaded slowly, each second pressing heavier against her chest. Finally, the numbers appeared, and her stomach dropped. A withdrawal she hadn't authorized. $3,500 gone. The source glared at her from the transaction log. Rachel Turner. Margaret gripped the phone tighter, her pulse thundering. The ink on her will was barely dry, and already her daughter had struck again, not at her pride this time, but at her livelihood. Margaret's reflection in the dark screen looked sharper now, her lips pressed into a thin line. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. She dialed her bank before the kettle on the stove had even cooled. The hold music rattled in her ear, jangly and out of place, until a representative answered with a bright, scripted greeting. "My daughter accessed my account without permission," Margaret said, her tone clipped. She rattled off the transaction date, amount, and Rachel's name with the precision of the accountant she once was. "I need everything frozen." Immediately, the representative paused, then confirmed. "Yes, ma'am, I see the transaction here. It was processed using online credentials associated with Rachel Turner. Would you like to dispute?" "No," Margaret cut in. "I want the record. Document it. Send me every detail you have." Her voice was steady, but her knuckles whitened against the counter. Numbers had always been her territory, and now numbers would be Rachel's undoing. Within the hour, an email landed in her inbox. A PDF of transaction logs, login, credentials, timestamps, proof. Margaret printed it, the sound of the machine churning filling her condo like a battle drum. She slipped the pages into her binder, slotting them into a clear sleeve next to Sophie's secret recording. Layer upon layer, the case was building. That afternoon, she carried the binder back into David Ross's office. The winter air clung to her coat, her breath still visible as she laid the fresh documents in front of him. David adjusted his glasses, scanning each page with surgical focus. His expression didn't change, but his pen tapped against the desk in a rhythm that betrayed his thoughts. "She didn't just take money," he said finally. "She left her footprints all over it. Logan records, device ID. It's as if she wanted to be caught." "Rachel has always assumed she's untouchable," Margaret replied, folding her hands. "It's time she learns she's not." David nodded once, already pulling a form from a drawer. "This qualifies as elder financial exploitation. We'll file immediately. It won't just protect you. It will ensure Rachel has a record she can't scrub clean." The pen scratched across the form, each stroke of ink carrying weight. David slid it across the desk. Margaret signed, her name flowing steady and unshaken. When she stepped back outside, snow had begun to fall again, dusting the pavement and muffling the city noise. She tightened her scarf, the binder under her arm heavier than ever, but it wasn't a burden. It was armor. Back at the condo, Sophie was waiting on the couch, textbooks sprawled across the coffee table, but forgotten. She jumped up the moment Margaret entered. "Did he do it?" Margaret set the binder down, unzipping it halfway so Sophie could see the new stack of evidence. Filed and sealed. Relief softened Sophie's face, though anger still simmered underneath. "She treats you like a stranger," Sophie said bitterly. Margaret's voice was calm, certain. "Then she'll be one, legally." They sat together in the quiet condo, the only sound the distant hum of the radiator and the tick of the old wall clock. Margaret sipped her tea, the bitterness grounding her. Sophie leaned into her side, a silent reminder that loyalty could skip a generation. The following day, the sharp knock at Margaret's door wasn't Rachel's, wasn't Tom's. It was heavier, deliberate. Margaret opened it to find a sheriff's deputy standing in the hallway, snowflakes melting on his uniform. A manila envelope rested in his gloved hand. "Mrs. Turner?" he asked. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady. "I'm here to serve Rachel Turner with a fraud summons." Just need to confirm this is her last known address. Margaret's lips curved faintly, not in joy, but in satisfaction. This is correct. The deputy nodded, tipped his cap, and turned to leave. Margaret closed the door softly behind him, her reflection catching in the hallway mirror. For the first time, she didn't see a humiliated mother or a forgotten widow. She saw a woman who had turned cruelty into evidence, theft into justice. Rachel had thought she could steal money and walk away. Now, the law would walk right to her door. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bouncing off the polished benches, where strangers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. At the front, the state seal gleamed above the judge's chair, stern and immovable. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, her binder resting neatly before her. Sophie sat just behind, her hands folded tightly in her lap, jaw clenched. Across the aisle, Rachel whispered frantically to Tom, her face painted in defiance, but her eyes flashing with unease. Tom's arm rested on the back of her chair, his expression tight, as though he'd rather be anywhere else than under these fluorescent lights. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. All rise. Everyone stood as the judge entered, robes sweeping the floor. He settled into his seat, glasses perched low on his nose, gaze sharp. Be seated. Rachel was called first. She rose, smoothing the hem of her blazer, and approached the podium. Your Honor, she began, her voice carrying that clipped tone Margaret knew too well, the voice Rachel used when she wanted to sound reasonable, polished. This was a mistake. I accessed the account thinking it was part of my financial management for my mother. It was confusion, not theft. Her words rolled across the courtroom, carefully measured, rehearsed. Margaret watched her daughter perform, the same way she had at that restaurant, confident, dismissive, sure no one would challenge her narrative. David Ross stood, buttoning his suit jacket, and stepped forward. With all due respect, Your Honor, he said calmly. The defense's claim of confusion doesn't hold. We have the records, he gestured toward Margaret, who rose with quiet dignity, her binder in hand. She crossed to the clerk's desk, the faint sound of paper rustling as she laid down the bank statements, transaction logs, and the email confirmation. The judge leaned forward, scanning. The account was accessed using Rachel Turner's credentials, David continued. The transaction wasn't ambiguous. It was deliberate. $3,500 transferred without authorization. The judge's brow furrowed as he flipped the pages. The numbers glared up from the paper, precise and undeniable. Additionally, David said, turning toward Sophie, we have supporting evidence of coercion attempts. Sophie rose from her seat, her phone in hand. She played the recording, her voice faint in the background but steady as Rachel's rang clear. You'll leave us the condo, right? Followed by Tom's smooth reinforcement. It's only fair after all we've done. The courtroom went silent. The audio echoed against the wood-paneled walls. Impossible to deny. Rachel's face drained of color. Tom shifted in his seat, jaw tight, eyes narrowed as though he wanted to tear the phone from Sophie's hand. The judge leaned back, his expression grave. He set the papers down and adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Turner, he said to Rachel, his tone clipped. This is not confusion. This is exploitation, and it will not be excused. Rachel's lips parted, but no sound came. The judge turned to the clerk. Order restitution in full. $3,500 repaid to Margaret Turner within 60 days. The gavel struck, sharp and final. Rachel sagged back into her chair, her hands trembling against her lap. Tom leaned close, whispering something harsh under his breath, his face dark with restrained fury. Margaret returned to her seat, her binder resting once more on the table. She smoothed the cover with her palm, her voice low but firm as she looked toward her daughter. This is just the start. Sophie reached forward, her hand brushing her grandmother's arm in silent solidarity. Rachel glared across the aisle, her composure cracked, her eyes hardening with something colder than shame. Margaret recognized it instantly, retaliation forming behind the mask of defeat. By the time Margaret and Sophie stepped into the crisp air outside the courthouse, her phone buzzed with a new notification. An email alert. She opened it, the subject line making her jaw tighten. Petition to contest will, filed by Rachel Turner. Margaret slipped the phone back into her coat pocket, the chill wind sharp against her cheeks. The courtroom battle had been won. The war for her legacy had just begun. Rachel's claim was bold, almost laughably so, that Margaret had been unduly influenced by Sophie Turner in rewriting her estate, that her granddaughter had manipulated her with emotional appeals, convincing her to disinherit her rightful heirs. Margaret read the words twice, then pushed the paper aside. Sophie sat across the table, nervously twisting the sleeve of her hoodie. "She's blaming me now," she whispered. Margaret reached across, covering Sophie's hand with her own. Her voice was calm, steady. "This isn't your fault. It's her pattern. When she loses, she finds someone else to blame." 2 weeks later, they found themselves back in court. The same wood-paneled walls, the same humming lights, but the atmosphere heavier now, as if everyone in the room knew this was no longer about numbers. It was about dignity. Rachel stood at the podium, her posture stiff, her tone practiced. "Your Honor," she began, "my daughter has been pressuring my mother, playing on her emotions. This entire will was drafted under Sophie's manipulation. My mother is vulnerable. She isn't making these decisions with full clarity." Tom sat beside her, nodding along, his lips pressed into a thin, rehearsed line of support. Margaret's stomach turned, not from fear, but from the sheer brazenness of the lie. Rachel had taken her plate at dinner, her money from the bank, and now she was trying to take Sophie's character. David Ross rose calmly, buttoning his jacket as he stepped forward. His voice was measured, deliberate. "Your Honor, we anticipated such claims. That's why we had Mrs. Turner evaluated before finalizing the will." He handed a document to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. The paper bore the letterhead of a respected physician, and in clear, decisive words it stated, "Patient is fully competent, lucid, and capable of making independent legal and financial decisions." The judge scanned the page, brow furrowed, lips pursed. David wasn't finished. "And for further clarity," he continued, "we have a recording of Rachel Turner and her husband Tom attempting to coerce Mrs. Turner into leaving them her condominium." At the defense table, Rachel stiffened. Tom shifted uneasily, his hand tightening around the edge of his chair. Sophie handed her phone to the clerk. A moment later, the audio filled the room. Rachel's voice was unmistakable, sharp and entitled. "You'll leave us the condo, right?" Followed by Tom's smooth reinforcement. "It's only fair after all we've done." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the spectators shifted, a few murmurs escaping before the bailiff barked for quiet. Rachel's face flushed crimson, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Tom's eyes stayed on the floor, his jaw locked. The judge leaned back, the papers still in his hand, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. His voice, when it came, was firm and final. "This is not undue influence. This is a clear attempt at coercion and a failed one. Petition dismissed." The gavel struck. The echo rolled through the chamber like a closing door. Margaret exhaled slowly, her hand brushing against her binder. A faint smile touched her lips, not wide, not triumphant, but steady, grounded. She hadn't just defended herself, she had defended Sophie. Rachel slumped into her chair, her shoulders rigid, her eyes flashing hatred rather than defeat. Tom leaned close, whispering something Margaret couldn't hear, but his face was stormy, his composure fraying. Margaret rose, Sophie at her side, David gathering his papers with the same calm efficiency he always carried. As they stepped out into the crisp Chicago air, Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting another text from Sophie or a confirmation from David. But the caller ID glowed with an unfamiliar number. She answered, her voice cautious. "Hello?" A warm professional voice came through. "Mrs. Turner, this is Allison Meyer from the Chicago Tribune. We're doing a feature on elder exploitation cases in the city. I've read about yours. Would you be willing to share your story?" Margaret froze on the courthouse steps, snow swirling faintly around her. For the first time, she realized her daughter's cruelty wasn't just a private wound anymore. It could become something public, something larger, and that possibility carried its own power. The article ran on a Sunday morning. Margaret woke to find Sophie already at the kitchen table, the newspaper spread wide in front of her. The scent of scrambled eggs and buttered toast lingered in the air, but Sophie wasn't eating. Her eyes were fixed on the bold headline across the Chicago Tribune's feature section. "Widow protects estate from daughter's greed." Below the words was a photograph, Margaret and Sophie standing together at the Senior Advocacy Center. Margaret had been hesitant when the reporter snapped the shot, her hand lightly resting on Sophie's shoulder. But now, seeing it in print, she realized the picture carried a message stronger than her hesitation. Her eyes scanned the article. Every line was factual, no embellishment. It told of her husband's careful planning, the estate binder, the humiliation at dinner, and the cold theft from her account. It mentioned Rachel and Tom by name, documented, indisputable. Margaret set the paper down, her tea cooling beside her. She expected her hands to shake, but they didn't. She felt something steadier, vindication. By noon, the whispers had begun. Neighbors in her condo building lingered a little longer in the lobby, voices dropping as she passed. At the grocery store, an old friend approached, squeezing Margaret's hand with sympathy. "I read the piece," she said softly. "Took courage to stand up like that." But the whispers weren't just around Margaret. They trailed Rachel too. Rachel's social circle, women she met for brunches, charity, events, and Pilates classes, turned frosty. Invitations dwindled. Conversations paused when she walked into the room. One even confronted her outright. "You humiliated your mother at a restaurant? In front of your own daughter?" Rachel stormed home from those gatherings, her fury spilling over in sharp words to Tom. But Tom was unraveling too. At his firm, the article made its rounds, whispered about in break rooms, and forwarded in emails. "Your wife's in the news," colleagues teased, though their smiles carried judgment. A client quietly pulled out of a contract, citing personal reasons. Tom's standing slipped, not from incompetence, but from association. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself strangely lighter. She walked into the senior center later that week, greeted not with pity, but respect. "We're glad you shared your story," one volunteer told her, pressing a hand to her arm. "It matters." At home that evening, Sophie curled beside her on the couch, her head resting against Margaret's shoulder. The framed article now sat on the mantel, beside David's photo and the binder. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the air scented faintly with pine from a candle Sophie had lit. Margaret studied the flames, her lips curving into a thin but certain smile. "She said I didn't matter," she murmured. The light flickered across her face as she added, "Now she doesn't?" Sophie squeezed her hand. Neither spoke further. The words had already landed, heavy with truth. But peace, Margaret had learned, never lingered long. It was nearly dusk the next evening when a knock rattled her front door. Not the measured rhythm of a neighbor, not the calm tap of Sophie's arrival. This was harder, impatient, vibrating through the wood like a demand. Margaret stiffened, her teacup half raised. Sophie froze on the couch, her phone slipping slightly from her hand. The knock came again, louder this time. Margaret rose, her slippers brushing softly against the floor as she crossed to the door. She hesitated only a moment before pulling it open. There stood Rachel. Her coat hung limp around her shoulders, her eyes red-rimmed and wild. Behind her, the hallway lights hummed, casting sharp shadows across her face. She didn't look like the polished woman from the restaurant or the courtroom. She looked frayed, cornered. "Mom," Rachel said, her voice low, taut with anger and desperation. We need to talk. For a moment, the two women simply stared. Mother and daughter, a gulf of years and wounds stretched between them. Sophie rose from the couch, positioning herself just behind Margaret like a shadow of protection. Rachel broke the silence first. "Mom," she said, her voice brittle, "I was out of line. That night at the restaurant, I shouldn't have said it. Please, forgive me." Margaret kept one hand on the edge of the door, steadying herself. The memory of that evening sharpened instantly. The waiters, hesitation, Rachel's wave of dismissal, the hot flush of shame. "You humiliated me in public," she said, her voice low but firm. Tom appeared at Rachel's shoulder, slipping into the hallway light as though he had been waiting there all along. His expression was smoother, practiced. "It was a joke," he said, shrugging. Rachel was joking. "You know how families are. We tease. We move on." "Jokes don't drain accounts," Sophie shot back, her tone cutting. Her arms folded across her chest, her stance unyielding. The words hit with a sharp finality that made Tom's jaw tighten. Rachel's gaze flicked to Sophie, narrowing. "Stay out of this," she snapped, her voice breaking through the fragile mask of apology. But Margaret didn't let her finish. "There's no space for you in my will," she said simply. The words dropped heavy, undeniable. Rachel's face hardened instantly. The softness in her eyes vanished, replaced by something sharp and cold. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her posture stiffened. For a moment, she looked almost like a stranger, someone Margaret didn't recognize, someone who had long since abandoned the title of daughter. Tom placed a hand on Rachel's arm, but she jerked away, her chest rising and falling with shallow, furious breaths. "After everything we've done," Rachel hissed, "this is how you repay us?" "You're siding with her," she thrust a finger towards Sophie, who didn't flinch. "You repaid yourself," Margaret said quietly, "with my money, with my dignity, and now you want more." The silence that followed was jagged, filled only by the faint hum of the hallway lights and the distant sound of traffic below. Rachel's eyes darted between them, her lips trembling as though torn between rage and desperation. Finally, she stepped back, pulling her coat tighter around her. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and dangerous now. "If you want a war, you'll have one." Tom followed, silent, his face stormy but measured. They descended the hallway quickly, their footsteps echoing against the tile until the sound faded into nothing. Margaret closed the door slowly, the lock clicking into place with a weighty finality. She turned and leaned against it, her breath steadying. Sophie hovered close, worry etched across her face. "You did the right thing," Sophie whispered. Margaret nodded faintly. "It wasn't about right. It was about truth." That night, Margaret sat at her desk, the binder open under the lamplight. Her pen hovered over a fresh sheet of paper as she reviewed the copies of her will, her estate, her defenses. Each line was intact, every clause fortified. Yet she knew Rachel too well to believe this was the end. The confirmation arrived the next morning. An email alert from David Ross appeared on her phone as she stirred sugar into her coffee. The subject line made her throat tighten. "Notice of motion filed. Rachel Turner." Margaret sat, the spoon down, the clink loud against the mug. So it was true. Even after begging, even after feigning regret, Rachel's face had hardened into exactly what Margaret expected. One last desperate attempt to claw back what was never hers. The war had only deepened. The summons landed on Margaret's doormat like a stone dropped in still water. David read it aloud in his office, his brow arched as if even he was impressed by Rachel's audacity. "She's claiming," he said, tapping the page with his pen, "that your public statements to the Tribune are evidence you've been unduly influenced, that Sophie and the senior advocacy group coached you, parading you around for sympathy to justify rewriting your will." Margaret gave a sharp, humorless laugh. "So now speaking the truth makes me incompetent." Sophie, seated beside her, bristled. "She's trying to punish you for telling your story. She can't stand that people know who she really is. David leaned back in his chair, calm but razor sharp. Then let's remind the court that telling the truth isn't coercion. It's clarity. The courtroom was crowded that day, curious locals filling the back benches after the newspaper article had stirred attention. Margaret could feel their eyes on her as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table. Sophie sat directly behind, her hand lightly brushing her grandmother's shoulder for reassurance. Rachel rose first, her hair sleek, her blazer crisp, her voice trembling only slightly as she began. Your Honor, my mother's recent behavior proves she is being manipulated. She allowed herself to be photographed, interviewed, and paraded in front of the press. These actions are not consistent with her private nature. Clearly, she's being coerced by Sophie and outside influences to cut me and my husband from the estate. This so-called independence is staged. She glanced back at the gallery, inviting judgment, her lips pursed with false indignation. Tom nodded at her side, silent but supportive, his arms crossed like a guard at the gate. David Ross stood without hurry, adjusting his tie as he approached the podium. Your Honor, the defense seems to believe that visibility equals incompetence. We disagree. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, sliding the first document across the clerk's desk. This is a letter from the senior advocacy group, confirming Mrs. Turner initiated contact on her own. No one pushed her forward. She sought them out to strengthen her estate protections. Next came another folder, thicker. Here, David continued, his tone measured but pointed, are the first responses from the scholarship fund Mrs. Turner established in her husband's name. These are thank you letters from students who've received support already. I'd like to read one excerpt. He adjusted his glasses and read aloud. Because of Mrs. Turner's generosity, I can afford my nursing textbooks this semester. She didn't just change her will, she changed my life. The courtroom fell into a hush. Even the judge leaned forward, his expression softening as he read the letter for himself. David let the silence linger before delivering the final blow. This is not manipulation. This is legacy. Clear, deliberate, and impossible to fake. Rachel's face had gone pale, but she lurched forward, her voice shrill. That doesn't prove anything. She's being used, can't you see that? The judge raised a hand, silencing her. His eyes were sharp now, his tone clipped. What I see, Ms. Turner, is a pattern. This is your third attempt to weaponize the courts against your mother after clear judgments have been made. This is harassment, not justice. The gavel struck once, firm and echoing. Motion dismissed. Fine of $2,000 for repeated frivolous filings, payable immediately. Rachel's mouth fell open, but no words came. Tom leaned closer, his jaw rigid, whispering something Margaret couldn't hear, his hand gripping Rachel's arm as though holding her together. Margaret exhaled slowly, closing her binder with a decisive snap. She turned slightly toward Sophie, her voice steady but low. Final nail in the coffin. Sophie's lips curved into a small, fierce smile. And you hammered it in yourself. By the end of the month, the consequences were unavoidable. Word spread quickly. Rachel and Tom, once so polished, had been evicted from their upscale rental. Debt and fines had caught up with them. Their neighbors saw the moving truck parked at dawn, cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly on the curb, while Rachel stood rigid, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. From her condo window, Margaret didn't watch. She didn't need to. The story was already written, and this chapter was theirs to live with. The knock came late in the evening, long after Margaret had settled into her armchair with a blanket and the soft hum of a jazz record filling the condo. She hesitated, the sound too sharp, too insistent to be Sophie's. When she opened the door, Rachel stood there, hair unkempt, eyes rimmed with red. The woman who once walked into restaurants with her chin high and her voice louder than the rest, now looked brittle, worn. Tom loomed behind her, his expression sour, a crease cut deep between his brows. "Mom," Rachel said, her voice cracking on the word. She clutched a crumpled envelope in her hands, shaking as she held it out. We need help. Please. The rent's overdue. The utilities. Everything's behind. We've got nothing left. Margaret let the silence stretch. The faint hiss of the record player drifted from the living room, the notes bending like ghosts through the hallway. She looked at her daughter, at the desperate set of her mouth, at the pleading eyes that once gleamed with arrogance. You told a waiter I didn't matter, Margaret said evenly. Now you don't matter in my will. Rachel flinched as though struck. Tom muttered under his breath, the words bitter, barely contained. This is bullshit. Sophie appeared from the living room, her face pale but steady. She stepped into the doorway, her presence a wall between Margaret and the weight of Rachel's despair. You made your choice, Mom, Sophie said firmly. Grandma made hers. Rachel's eyes darted between them, wild. Her lips trembled, and the envelope slipped from her hands, falling to the floor with a soft slap. Inside, Margaret caught a glimpse of bills, overdue notices, final warnings, red ink screaming across the paper. For years, Margaret had watched Rachel stride through life demanding more, sneering when it wasn't enough. And now here she was, undone by her own choices, sobbing in the hallway like a child. Please, Rachel whispered, her voice splintering as tears blurred her mascara. She collapsed against the doorframe, shoulders shaking. I don't know what else to do. I have nothing. Nothing. Margaret's chest tightened, but not with pity. The ache she felt wasn't for Rachel. It was for the decades she had wasted believing her daughter might soften, might learn respect. That fantasy was gone. What remained was truth, stark and unrelenting. You always wanted everything, Margaret said quietly. And now, you finally understand what nothing feels like. Rachel sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. Tom stood stiff beside her, jaw clenched, eyes blazing at Margaret with a hatred that burned but didn't move her. Margaret stepped back into the condo. Goodbye, Rachel. She closed the door firmly, the latch clicking like a lock on the past. Inside, the record spun on, the music warm and steady, filling the silence that followed. Sophie exhaled, her hand pressing to her grandmother's arm. You did what you had to, she whispered. Margaret nodded, though her gaze lingered on the closed door. She wasn't celebrating, but she wasn't mourning either. For the first time, Rachel's desperation had no power here. 2 days later, the mail arrived. Among the envelopes was a small package, heavier than the rest. Margaret slid it open carefully, the cardboard giving way to polished wood and a brass plate gleaming in the light. The Turner Scholarship Fund, established in honor of David and Margaret Turner. Margaret's throat tightened as she traced the letters with her fingertip. Sophie leaned over her shoulder, smiling softly. Grandma, she said, her voice proud. This is your legacy. Margaret set the plaque on the mantel beside David's photograph, the polished wood catching the glow of the afternoon sun. Outside, the city moved on, cars, chatter, the hum of life, but in her condo, there was only quiet certainty. Rachel wanted everything. Margaret had given her nothing, and nothing had never felt so solid. The plaque had already claimed its place on the mantel, polished wood gleaming above David's photo. Margaret didn't need to trace the letters again. She had memorized them. Instead, she found herself standing across the room, tea in hand, watching the afternoon sun strike the brass until it glowed like fire. Sophie padded into the living room, school bag still slung over one shoulder. She paused when she saw her grandmother staring at the wall. It looks permanent, she said softly, setting the bag down. Margaret nodded. That's the point. The two sat together on the couch, a quiet pride humming between them. Sophie leaned against her shoulder, her voice low. Your name will last longer than hers. Margaret's lips curved faintly. Yes, and not because I shouted it louder, but because I carved it into something real. The doorbell broke the moment. Margaret rose, adjusting her cardigan as she went to the door. When she opened it, David Ross stepped in, his coat flecked with snow, briefcase heavy in his hand. Afternoon, Mrs. Turner, he greeted, shaking off the chill. I thought you'd like a final update." He set his case on the dining table, clicking it open with practiced precision. Margaret and Sophie joined him, the air thick with anticipation. David withdrew a thick packet of documents, each page embossed with notary seals and court stamps. "This," he said, sliding the top page toward her, "is the fully executed estate plan. Every clause is signed, filed, and recorded. The scholarship fund is secured. Sophie's inheritance is locked under protective trust until she's of age. And Rachel?" He looked up, his gaze steady. "She is permanently excluded." Margaret's fingers brushed the edge of the page. The paper felt heavy, official, final. For years she'd feared Rachel would find a way in. A loophole, a trick, a plea to sentiment. But this time, there was nothing left to claw at. "She's locked out forever," David added, his tone firm. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It came deep and steady, as if it had been waiting years to leave her chest. "Good," she said. "That's exactly what she earned." David tapped the last page for her signature. She picked up the pen, her hand steady now where once it had trembled. The ink flowed smoothly across the paper, binding her decision into law. With a quiet click, David closed the file and tucked it back into his case. "Your estate is ironclad," he said. "You've done more than disinherit someone. You've safeguarded your legacy." Margaret walked him to the door, thanking him with a firmness that matched the moment. When the latch clicked behind him, she returned to the mantel. The plaque gleamed back at her, David's photo watching silently beneath it. For the first time in years, Margaret felt no weight on her shoulders, only clarity. Sophie joined her, sliding an arm around her waist. "You did it," she whispered. Margaret's voice was soft but resolute, "and she'll never undo it." They stood together in the glow of the plaque, the apartment quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. Margaret exhaled again, steady this time, like a woman who had finally sealed every open crack in her defenses. But peace never lasted long where Rachel was concerned. 3 days later, Margaret sifted through the day's mail, bills, a catalog, a flyer for winter sales, and at the very bottom, a plain white envelope with no return address. She froze. The handwriting on the front was sharp, familiar, unmistakable, Rachel's. Margaret turned the envelope over in her hands, the weight of it heavier than the paper should allow. She didn't open it, not yet, but even unopened, it carried the bitter sting of her daughter's voice. The final letter had arrived. The envelope lay on the dining table for 3 days, heavy as a brick though it was no thicker than a bill. Each morning Margaret passed it, her fingers brushing the edge as if testing her own resolve. The handwriting was Rachel's, sharp, slanted, a script Margaret had once taught her daughter at the kitchen table decades ago. Now it looked like a weapon scrawled across the page. On the 4th morning, Margaret didn't hesitate. She lifted the envelope, slid a finger beneath the flap, not to read it, but to tear it. The paper ripped clean down the middle, then again across the fold. The sound was crisp, satisfying, like the crack of dry wood in a fireplace. She dropped the shredded pieces into the trash bin and stood over it, watching the paper settle. "No more," she whispered, her voice steady. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but release. Later, she carried her coffee to the balcony. The air was brisk, the city alive beneath her. Horns blared faintly from downtown, mingling with the rhythmic crunch of tires on slushy streets. The wind bit against her cheeks, but the mug's warmth seeped through her hands, grounding her. She leaned against the railing, watching the skyline. For the first time in months, her chest didn't ache with waiting, for a call, for an apology, for a change that would never come. The sliding door opened softly. Sophie stepped outside, pulling her sweater tighter. She joined her grandmother at the railing, eyes on the same skyline. "You matter to me, Grandma," Sophie said quietly, her breath a puff of white in the air. Margaret turned to her, heart swelling at the certainty in her granddaughter's voice. No performance, no manipulation, just truth. She touched Sophie's cheek. Her hand warmed despite the cold. That's all I need, she replied. They stood in silence, the city stretching before them, two figures bound not by inheritance, but by loyalty. By week's end, the mail brought something new. Not bills, not threats, letters. Margaret carried the small stack to her table, slicing them open carefully. Each envelope contained a handwritten note from a student, a thank you sent through the scholarship fund. Because of your generosity, I can focus on my nursing program without working 3 jobs. You reminded me people believe in me, even when my family doesn't. This scholarship saved me from dropping out. I'll never forget the name Turner. Margaret read each line slowly, her eyes misting, though her lips curved in quiet pride. She smoothed the first letter flat and slid it into a frame. When she set it on the mantel beside the plaque, the sight nearly overwhelmed her. For once, her name wasn't being twisted into leverage. It was being honored. Sophie came in from school that evening, dropping her bag with a thud and joining her grandmother at the mantel. She read the framed note aloud, her voice catching on the words. Grandma, this is your real legacy. Margaret's throat tightened, but she nodded. Not Rachel, not her anger. This winter rolled in with sharp winds and nights that arrived too early. The streets below were lined with salt and slush, holiday lights strung across balconies glowing against the long dark. Margaret settled into her evenings with tea and books, Sophie often beside her with schoolwork. The phone sat silent on the counter. Days passed, weeks, no calls from Rachel. And for the first time, Margaret realized she didn't expect one. The silence wasn't absence, it was peace. The winter evening wrapped the condo in silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. Margaret sat at her desk, lamplight spilling across stacks of neatly organized papers. Her binder lay open before her, the crisp pages of her estate plan glinting under the warm glow. Each tab was color-coded, each clause highlighted with precision. She traced a finger along the section that once bore Rachel's name. That space was empty now, replaced with Sophie's, protected by legal scaffolding Rachel couldn't touch. Next to it, the scholarship fund was spelled out in careful detail, an unshakable promise to strangers who would carry the Turner name with pride instead of bitterness. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the restaurant, the scent of garlic and wine, the clink of silverware, Rachel's sharp voice cutting across the table like glass. Skip her order. She doesn't matter. The humiliation had burned then, but now the memory no longer stung. It hardened into resolve. A soft knock came at the study door. Sophie peeked in, her hair damp from a shower, dressed in sweats. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her grandmother, hugging her tightly from behind. You won, Sophie whispered. Margaret smiled faintly, placing her hand over Sophie's. No, she said. I secured peace. Sophie rested her chin on her grandmother's shoulder, looking down at the binder. It's all finished then, Margaret nodded. Finished and filed. She can't take anything from me again. Together they closed the binder with a decisive snap. Margaret slid it into the bottom drawer of the desk, the sound of the metal runners humming as it slid shut. She turned the key, locking it away, not because she feared Rachel would ever see it, but because it no longer needed to. Sit open like a wound, the study was quiet now, save for the steady hum of the heater. Margaret rose from the desk, Sophie trailing after her, and walked into the living room. The plaque caught her eye immediately, the brass letters glowing softly in the lamplight. The Turner Scholarship Fund. David's photo sat below, framed and steady, watching over it as if he'd been a part of the decision himself. Margaret lowered into the armchair across from it, her shoulders relaxing as she leaned back. Sophie perched on the couch, watching her grandmother's expression. Do you feel different? Sophie asked. Margaret considered the question. She touched the armrest lightly, her eyes fixed on the plaque. For the first time in years, she said slowly, I don't feel like I'm waiting. Not for her apology, not for her approval, not for anything. Sophie smiled softly, pulling the blanket across her lap. Then that's the real victory. The night deepened outside, the city lights shimmering against the snow. Margaret sipped her tea, breathing in the faint scent of chamomile, the steam warming her face. She looked once more at the plaque, at David's steady smile frozen in the photograph, and felt something shift inside her, something light, unburdened. She smiled, softly but fully, the kind of smile that carried no trace of bitterness, only release. At dinner, she whispered, half to herself, half to Sophie. My daughter told the waiter, "Skip her order, she doesn't matter," so I made sure she didn't matter in my will. The words didn't ache anymore. They settled into the air like a seal, final and irrevocable. Margaret leaned back, exhaling slow and steady. For the first time in a long time, the silence in her condo wasn't heavy. It was freedom.